So a little over a week ago, I made a video about a kid named Brandt Jean, who displayed radical forgiveness to the murderer of his brother Botham Jean, and I spent some time talking specifically on the topic of forgiveness. Now, in the video, we talked about forgiveness, what it means to forgive, why it's good for you to forgive, and how it makes it easier to do with the Christian worldview in mind. But what I didn't talk about was justice. I meant to follow up with a video on justice right after, but I got so busy that I just didn't have the time. Now, though there was a lot of people who thought that the brother's willingness to forgive the murder of his brother was a beautiful display of forgiveness, there were others, especially from the black community, who were really upset at the situation and felt like justice wasn't served. Now, as a black man, I can understand where they're coming from. A lot of them felt like the forgiveness that Brandt showed towards Amber is the same mindset that kept black slaves in slavery for so long, since slave masters would use Bible verses in order to keep the slaves in submission. They felt as though Christian forgiveness was invoking the same mindset that hurt us in the past. And as Charlemagne says,
to me, this is just what happens when you worship white Jesus all your life, okay? White Jesus is not your ally, black people. You will never rebel against any master that appears in the physical form of your oppressors. It is impossible. And it's also impossible for the oppressors to not view themselves as God, and they will always feel like they are right by virtue and natural order, even when they have done us wrong, like Amber Guyger did that brother Botham Jean wrong. I understand what she's saying, but I can't help but see situations like this and think to myself, this is the effects of Christian slaveholders using the Bible to justify things like slavery. Like they would whip our abuse us, rape us, persecute us, and then tell us to forgive them because not forgiving them would make God punish us.
Now, I've done some videos on the slave Bible in the past and a series on slavery in the Bible, so we won't recap that here. But given what Charlemagne said, that leads to obvious questions such as, under what conditions should we forgive? Or is Christian forgiveness really hurting the black community? And if we do forgive, should it be at the expense of justice? Well, to start, let's be clear on what forgiveness is. Now, I talked about this some in the last video, but basically, when someone wrongs you, it costs you something. If not financially, it does so emotionally. So if someone breaks something that you own, you can either have them pay it back, or you can just absorb that cost and pay for it yourself. If you decide to pay for it yourself, then you're choosing to pay for it instead of having them pay for it. But regardless, the cost still has to be paid. Now, the same is true when someone hurts you emotionally. You're left with an emotional cost that needs to be paid. So when we decide to make the person pay for that emotional cost, that's what we're seeking when we're trying to get revenge. We're trying to make them pay for the emotional debt that they left us with. Now, the debt has to be paid, and so we can try to make them pay it by retaliating, or we can choose not to retaliate and pay those emotional costs ourselves. And if we choose to pay for it ourselves, that's called forgiveness. Forgiveness is when we decide not to make them pay for it and decide not to seek revenge, and instead we choose to absorb those emotional costs for them. Now, to be clear, even if we pay the emotional costs, that doesn't mean that justice shouldn't be sought. In my mind, I break it up like this. So, Amber Guyger killing Botham means that there's a lot of parties that are owed a debt from her actions. And just to name three, let's say Botham's brother, God, and the court, okay? So now, Botham's brother decided not to seek personal justice, and he decided to personally forgive his brother's murder. Now, if you can imagine the emotional debt that he was left with, then you can imagine just how significant him choosing to pay the debt himself truly was. It seems inhuman. But as I argued in the other video, this is a lot easier when we can grasp the depths of just how much Christ has forgiven us. But just because Brandt decided to forgive his brother's murder doesn't clear her from her debt of crimes towards God and towards the courts. Those are handled by God and the courts separately. Now, her debt with God is between her and God, and when it comes to the courts, well, that's the court's responsibility. Now, I personally don't believe that justice was served. I think that her sentence was way too light, given that she was convicted of murder rather than manslaughter, especially given that we have far more people in prison for far longer sentences that didn't take innocent life. Because in reality, she's only going to serve about 5 or 6 years. But to be clear, I can only speak as somebody who's just a citizen and wasn't in the jury. So it's possible that there were some things that the jury knew that the public didn't that swayed their decision. But aside from this case literally being one of the strangest cases we've ever seen, it seems like our justice system failed us. But unfortunately, that's in the hands of the justice system. But what we can do is work to improve it by helping more qualified people to help correct it, or do the hard work and become some of those people ourselves. So in this case, I would say judicial justice is something that Christians and non-Christians alike can work to improve and restore. Now, one more thing to consider with forgiveness is that by forgiving others, we want what's best for that person. So that doesn't mean that being forgiving is the same thing as enabling. You can forgive someone by not enabling them. And I think that's both biblical and practical. Now, for those that are struggling with forgiveness, trust me, I get it. It's a lot easier said than done. And also, I know it's a lot easier for us to justify ourselves for all kinds of reasons why we shouldn't forgive and all kinds of reasons why we're validated in seeking revenge. So if you're going through this, here's the advice that I would want to offer you. Now, let's say you're hearing this and you say, I understand the two options and I choose revenge. I want to make them pay for the emotional debt and pain that they caused me. Well, first, if you decide to choose revenge, keep in mind that you may never get it. And if you don't, you'll be living with that anger, bitterness, and frustration for the rest of your life. And while you continue to stay mad and suffer from their actions, they might have forgotten all about it and moved on already. So really, they still win because not only did they make you suffer then, but as the years go by, they're still making you suffer while they probably forgot all about it. But even if you are able to get revenge one day, you won't find yourself loving them more, but instead you'll find yourself hating them more. You won't find yourself growing softer and more loving, but instead you'll be growing more angry and more bitter. So nourishing those feelings in your heart will only continue to grow and will ultimately consume you. Even if you do feel better in getting revenge, you won't become more loving or understanding. So with that said, I know that it's hard, and in the other video I talk about why it's a lot easier to forgive under the Christian worldview. So watch that video if you want to learn more. But even if you aren't a Christian, I still think that forgiveness is still the best route to take for the reasons that we just talked about. Whatever you believe, I hope this video helped give you a little perspective. So what are your thoughts on the concepts of justice and forgiveness? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Whatever it is, I want to hear your thoughts down below. And the next time someone says,
This is the effects of Christian slaveholders using the Bible to justify things like slavery.
what are you going to say? What do you mean?